Hey guys, my name is Michael Reed, and this is going to be a quick video tutorial on web scraping. So what do I mean by web scraping for this video? I'm talking about any method of automatically pulling data from websites, not necessarily just the strict definitions of web scraping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide you with a couple of examples on different methodologies and how we could do that. So the first example we're going to cover is this website pololu.com, which is just a supplier of robotics and electronics modules. And in this case, I've brought up the page that shows a list of brushed DC motor drivers as the category. So maybe for this example, it's just an example, I know it maybe doesn't make full sense, I want to extract the name of each of these products as well as the price of each of these products. So obviously, if I don't have any background in how web pages work or something like that, I may decide to go and manually copy and paste each of these out, put them into a spreadsheet, and use that to store the data so I can plot it or do whatever I want to do. But as the number of products increases, you can see that this is very quickly going to balloon out to taking a lot of time. So ideally, we would like some methodology of either directly accessing the structured data that we want, that is the name and the price in this case, or some automatic scripts that can go through and extract that information and store it in that structured format so that we can do things like put it into a spreadsheet or whatever it is that we want to do. So depending on how the website is set up, there are actually a few different options that we have to do this. Some of them may allow us to very directly essentially just copy and paste out a section of pure data, which is already structured, and maybe that'll be in like a JSON format or something, which I'll come to later. But sometimes it's a little bit more complicated and we may need to write some very simple scripts. And in this case, I'm going to use Python. Rest assured, a lot of cases, you're not going to have to do it yourself. And even when you do, the scripts are incredibly simple. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to go through, how to set up the libraries. And it's usually about like 30 lines of code, which are very basic, and you can copy and paste most of them out from these examples, which I will provide in a GitHub repo as well. So I'm going to be covering and going through these three different options that we have for pulling out this data in the context of our examples, and I have one more example to go through for the rendered browser implementation. So the first thing is APIs. Now what APIs are is essentially a type of function that you can call directly from a server. So in this case, what we did is if we go to the browser and we type in this URL and we hit enter, the server, the computer that's providing us this website, is actually sending us back a whole bunch of HTML and JavaScript in this case, in order to display what we actually see in front of us. But fundamentally, all it is just code, it's just text. So if I right click on an area that I'm interested in and hit inspect, that's going to open for me the DevTools manager. And what this is, it's just a sort of like developer tool, so it's usually for people that are interested in making websites or editing websites or whatever, to go in and understand what is actually returned by the server in code and how that is used to render things out. So that's great. I can go through that, and I will show you an example on how to do that in a second. But in some cases, the websites will provide a more direct method for specifically accessing types of data. So what I'm going to first show you is this website, for example, that I can type in. And this is just an example API that's on the web, which in this case lists a list of universities inside a particular country. Now, as you can see, this isn't a website, it's just data. In this case, it's actually in a JSON format. So I could just copy this out, paste it into various different types of tools that could convert that to a CSV or a spreadsheet or whatever it is for me. So if I can access directly the data like this, this is perfect for what I need. But not all websites are going to have that available, and not all websites that have that available are going to publish them in an open fashion that gives you examples and guidance on how to use them. So in our particular example, the best way for us to start is to literally just Google what we want. So in this case, we're looking at pololu.com. So I'm going to search for Pololu API, and we will actually see that they have released an API, which means that you can use code to directly access the data that you want, and you don't have to go through the website like this. So you can just write scripts that directly access this. Now, GitHub has this example, which you can go through and understand, the format of the data that responds and like how you're meant to format the URLs that you generate, and if there's anything else that you need to provide. I'm not going to go into too much detail through that because there are a lot of other tutorials you can find online. I'll probably link a couple of things in terms of how to use APIs. And in most cases, like it's just a slightly more complicated of essentially doing this, where you enter in a URL of a certain kind and it responds back with data. And you can either consume that through the terminal using curl, or you can use Python scripts, whatever it is. Now, in this case, what I do want to show you is a more interesting case where it's not open. So another example that I'm going to use for this is a coworker of mine actually approached me as this is something that he did himself. So he wanted to go to automationdirect.com, and they're again just an electrics component suppliers. And he wanted to create a plot which compared the price to the power throughput of a VFD, which is a variable frequency drive. It's just an electric component. Don't worry about it too much. So how do we go about doing this if we don't have an open API that we can access? So luckily, those dev tools that we opened before actually provide us with a whole range of different tools, which are surprisingly easy to use, that can help us sniff out the APIs that this website may be using. So in this case, let's go back into the dev tools. And so one of the easiest ways to do that is just to right-click anything and go inspect. But we can also open it directly through one of the menus. And in this case, rather than elements, which shows us the HTML code, we're going to go into network. So what network does is it shows us all of the internet requests that the website is making while the page loads. And so we can look for if this website itself is making requests to an API and returning back data. And we may get lucky in that one of those API requests is returning back the specific data that we want, which in this case is a list of VFD products and the details about them. And then the website is just using JavaScript to put that into the HTML and render it in the UI. So what we're going to do is this button up here is clear. So in case we have anything already in there, we can click that just to make sure that we don't have any data that's muddling up our interface. Now, one thing that I am going to suspect is that if I change the view of this, it's going to make a request to update the information so that it can re-render it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear before I do so, and then I'm going to click this. And we're going to see that a number of things come down here. So the interface here actually provides for us a number of different filtering methods. You can actually see that I've selected fetch and XHR here. So if I click all instead, it's going to show a whole bunch of different things, including every single image that it loads. Every time it needs to load like a font or whatever it is, it will all be shown here. But if we're doing specifically API requests, that is a fetch or XHR type of response. So if I just click this section here, it's now filtering down to only those. So another thing that we can also do here, which is kind of useful, is if I click something again, it's obviously going to run more queries, it's going to list them all up, but maybe what I want to do is I want to stop it after I do something of interest, so that the only things I have here are the things during my interaction that's of interest to me. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to grid. Now I've got all this stuff here that I don't care about, so I'm going to clear it, then I'm going to go to table, which hopefully forces the website to make that API request that we're interested in, so I'm going to click it. Comes up with stuff here, and then I'm going to hit this button, which is just stop recording. So don't record any more requests at the moment. Okay, so now I have a list of these things, which I think are probably some sort of some sort of API request, because they're a fetch XHR type of request. So what I can do is I can click on each of them, and there's a whole bunch of different things that we can go through here, and you don't really need to understand any of what these do because you don't care about it for the most part. But the thing that we are interested in this case, because it's going to be what we're looking for, hopefully, is the response. So what the response is it's the actual data, the text that was returned by the server when the website made this request. So in this case, there's a whole bunch of stuff here that I don't know if it's necessarily interesting, but I can go through to the response here. And if you just poke around with it, obviously this stuff seems kind of like gibberish. I don't necessarily think that's relevant to me. But as I go through the different sections, I can see that this one has item code, and it's got a primary description. It's got an image file name. It's got a whole bunch of different data here. And it turns out that this does actually contain everything that we want. And so if I go to, for example, price here, 150, and if I expand this back out so we can see our section again, that is actually the entry for this first one here, which has the price of 150. And if my presumption is correct, then I can probably presume if I go down to the next entry in this list and I find price, it's going to be 164, which as you can see is the price of the next one in this list. So just by going into the dev tools here and sniffing the responses here, I don't need to understand anything about the API works. All I need to know is that when I click this button, it's probably going to request data about the stuff that it's changing. Come in here, click through all of the different options, see what each of them does. So for example, this one provided an empty list. I don't need to care why it did that, it's just not relevant to me. But once I come to the one that has the data that I'm interested in, I can literally just control paste this out to somewhere else as structured data, which I can use to then make a CSV or whatever it is that I want to do. So to kind of round out this specific example, what I did here is I copied all of this text, and in this case, just to make sure that I only had the bits that I wanted, I pasted it into some sort of editor, and you can see that I've deleted everything up until the actual list of responses. So if you go back here, that starts here. I've got response, docs, and then it starts a list at that point. So I've deleted everything before and after that so that I just have this structured information. So once I have that, what I can do is I can copy all of it. I can just Google JSON to CSV converter and then literally paste it in to whatever the thing you find. In this case, it was just the first option that I saw. Paste it in here, and you can see that it will then render out a CSV, which can be downloaded as a spreadsheet or whatever it is, which has all of the information that is stored inside there. You can see some of them are empty, but it doesn't really matter because we can go through and delete the columns really quickly and easily after we have this data. So in this case, I can download the results and I can do it as an Excel format. I can open up this and you can see that all of the information that I wanted is very quickly and easily stored inside this format. Okay, so if we don't have access to an open API or even one that's closed that we need to sniff out ourselves, what do we have left as options? First one is static HTML scraping. The second one is rendered browser emulation. So we're going to start with static HTML scraping because it's a little bit easier to set up, it's a little bit simpler, and it use the same principles when you go into rendered browser emulation. The only issue with static HTML scraping is that it's not going to work for all modern websites, which I'll show you an example of in a second as well. So we'll go back to our Pololo example. So how do we start this process of determining how we want to scrape data out of the HTML code? So the first thing, like we did just before, is we want to go to the area that we're interested in, and we're going to right click and go down to inspect, because that's going to open up the HTML code for the area that we're interested in looking at. Now the first step that we're going to need to do is go through and sort of just like find the areas of interest that are going to cover what we want. And so you'll notice as well that as I highlight over different sections of the HTML code, it's going to show me on the interface what that's actually affecting on the rendered website. So that's really useful because in this example, I can see that the div, which is just a type of element, it's like a container, each of these divs with the class of category product seems to correspond with a single entry inside this list of products. So if I was to loop through each of these individual divs, I could probably go through them inside and then extract the information that I want, one for each of the products. So that's great, but how do we actually start writing a script to go through and do this? So we're going to be using a very popular and very well-known Python library called Beautiful Soup. So I've got a very basic little script here, and there's very few things that are actually of importance here. The very first thing that you're going to want to do is install Beautiful Soup. So in this case, it's just pip install Beautiful Soup. And there's a couple different versions of it. So we want to go with 4, which has been the current version for a very long time. I don't know why it's called Beautiful Soup. I don't know why they still use the number in the name. The point is you want Beautiful Soup 4. After you've done that inside your script, you're just going to want to import it. So in Python, it's referred to as BS4. So from BS4, we import Beautiful Soup. This is something I'm using for typing down here. This is the only bit that's really important for you. So after you've imported it, the first thing that you need to do is actually pull down that information from the website in the same way that your browser does. So when you go into your browser and you go and you hit enter, all it's actually doing is making a request, which then sends back this HTML data and possibly also JavaScript. So we can do the same thing using a built-in library in Python, which is the requests library. So what I'm doing is I'm porting that here. I've got the URL for the place of interest that I'm looking at, and then I'm running requests.get this URL. Now, this headers and timeout thing are actually kind of just nice to haves that I'm doing for like error checking later, but all you really need is actually this section here. And then similarly, the bit below down here, all I'm doing is checking to see if the request actually went through or if it failed. It's not something that you necessarily need to do every time. It's just something that I'm doing in this particular case. So the only sections that you actually need to run for the bare basics of everything working is, give me 2 seconds, this, which is just setting the URL, making a request.get to the URL, and then the last step that we do is we use Beautiful Soup to pass that information. So what that just means is that HTML is clearly structured. There is some way of telling how things are grouped together and things like that. But what you actually return from the website is just text. So what Beautiful Soup does is it sorts that information in a way that you can automatically go and search through it for specific things that you're interested in, such as those category product entries that we were looking at before. So how do I actually go about extracting each of these category product objects and then going through their internal structured data to pull out this information? So the first thing that I probably want to do is extract a list of these category products. So what we can do using Beautiful Soup is that we take this structured object that we just used that passed the HTML, and we're going to run a function on it, or a method, called findAll, which means we want to find all of the elements within this document, so within this HTML document, that follows the constraints that I'm going to provide inside. So what that means, what we provide here specifically, is we're looking for a div. I'm looking for a div with the class of category product. So why did I pick those? It's just because if you go back to here, you can see that this element is of type div. You don't really need to understand what that is or what it actually means. All you need to know is that each of these things that you're interested in is a div. But you'll notice that there are lots of other divs inside the rest of the document. And so you need to further specify the things that you're interested in by seeing whatever values that they have on it. In this case, it's quite easy because they are a class of category product. So what we're doing there is we're saying we want a div with a class of category product. So now we can run this and test to see if it's working up to that point. The easiest way for us to do that is we can drop a breakpoint here and we can go start debugging. It's going to run through our code up until that point, and then in the variable section we're going to have product entries, which is this variable that we created here, and you're going to see that it is going to be a list of, so you can see different entries in the lists of text, well, structured HTML documents, because it's actually still structured from soup. It's not just text at this point, that contains each of those entries. So we can also go into the debug console, and if we want to get like a bit of a better view of this, sorry. I'm going to go product entries, and then that obviously has a list, so I'm interested in just seeing the first one maybe. And you can see if you go through here that it is very specifically the information that I'm looking for, which I can go back and compare to either the text inside here or specifically the HTML in this section, which is great because now I have a list of these category products. So the next section is going inside each of those category products and extracting the further information that we're interested in. So we're going to take this example one step further just to make things a little bit interesting. So we're going to say in this example that maybe it's not displayed the price immediately in this list here. And so instead, maybe what we need to do is we need to follow the link to the product page, and that's where the price is listed. So but the next thing that we're going to do in order to do this is we're going to extract the link from this category product object to take us to the next page, which we can then again use the request library to load and do the same thing again. So if I go back to my code, what we've got is our product entries, and again this is a structured HTML document which beautiful soup has already passed for us. We're going to go through each of those in a for loop, and the first thing that we can do is we can obviously directly extract the product name. So the way that I got there again was I went inside this section, and there's a class here called product name and description, which is a very easy way for us to find it. But I can also manually just go to the bit that I'm interested in, which is that, and inspect it directly, which will take me down to this section here. So if I go back to the bit that I'm interested in, what I did is I looked for the class, I looked for a div which contains the class product name. So actually, in this case, this is div class product name. So again, there are lots of divs, so all we need to do is we need to specify by product name. Now, because we're looking specifically inside the product entry instead of the whole document like we did originally, this is only going to return us the divs with the class product name inside that product entry, which means there's only going to be one, which is great. Then the last thing that I do is that because this actually returns to us an element, all we want is the text that's actually inside that element, which is this text here. So that just has a method called .text, or an attribute called text. So we're going to pull it out, we're going to strip it just because it'll have carriage returns and things on either side, and that is the name extracted. And again, what we can do is put a breakpoint and just test to see how this goes. So I'm going to start debugging. It's going to go through that. I'm going to get to that point, and then I'm going to go in my variables and I'm going to look for name, and you can see that it is Palolo Dual Shield VNH 501 which is exactly what we want. So great, it's working. So the next step that we want is we want to get that link, and so luckily that link is actually within the same subclass of thing, but here we just need to specifically look for an anchor element, which again you don't really need to worry about what this is, but it's just the thing that contains the link to the next product. So if I actually copy link address and then go to a new thing, copy it in, that will just take me to the product page in the same way that clicking this would take me to the product page. So I want to extract that in the same way. So what I'm going to do is The actual bit that's stored in the href, because the way that anchor things work is that it'll store a relative URL. So because we're already on Palooza.com, what it's just going to say is that you just need to go to product 2507, which really will point you towards Palooza.com/product/2507. So I'll just say that too. That's the only reason that we call this relative URL, and then later on we add Palooza.com to the start. Now the other thing that is inside this relative URL, which we may find useful, is the product code. And that just might be valuable for us to finding something relative to Palooza's system later. So you can see that the way that they make each of those links is each product has product code. So something that I'm just extracting for the purposes of my information is also the product code, which is just taking that relative URL, splitting it by slashes, and then taking the last part. So now we have this product URL. Again, what I can do to test it is come down here. I'm just going to cancel this one, move this breakpoint, run it again. I know I could have stepped through, but whatever. And I'm going to go to product URL, this guy, and I'm going to copy and just test to see if it works. And it does. Great. Yay. So the next step that we want to do is actually follow that link inside our code to make a request for that website, and then do the same thing again to extract the price out from the elements inside that page. So in this case, here. So I'm not going to handhold you through this entire section like I did before, but as you can see, what I'm just doing is exactly the same thing as I've done before. So I did request.url, but in this case I'm using the new URL, which I generated from the information that I extracted from the element. And so after I make the request for it, I do the same thing again, checking for a status code, but it's not something you actually need to do. What I am doing in this case though is that if I find a object inside this list of product entries that maybe isn't exactly what I want. So for example, maybe it turns out that there is another div with category product that doesn't contain a link or something like that. There's a whole bunch of them, so I don't know if that's the case. What I decided that I want to do is I want to just skip past it if that doesn't exist. And so in this case, what I did is if there is some error code returned from trying to get this page, rather than just let it fail and have an error come up, I just decided to go continue, which means go back to the next loop in this for loop and skip this particular instance. But that's not something you necessarily want to do. It's just something I did to make things run a little bit more smoother for me. If you're doing things manually, you kind of skip through this with a manual process. Now, just like before, I used the beautiful seep function to pass the HTML of this page, so product raw page.content. And then similarly, I went through to find the pricing element, which is a table of class pricing. And again, if I just come up here and I open up this and I inspect it, you can just see that it brings up a table with the class of pricing, which we're going to get into it. And then again, I just sort of go through it and I find the second row and then the second element in the second row, because this is the second row and this is the second element in the second row, which is the price. And then I store that. And then the last thing that I'm doing here, just for the sake of my example, is I'm storing everything inside a dictionary, which is keyed by that product code, which I pulled from the relative URL. So if I then just remove that breakpoint and then I run everything as it is, and again, you can do this with run and debug or however you prefer, but it's going to print out for me. It's obviously going to take a little bit of time, because now what it's doing is it's making a request for each of these different pages individually. But after it's complete, it's going to print out this dictionary of all of the entries for me. So I stopped recording for a second so that I could finish, because it took a little bit longer than I expected. But then also after that, I decided to go back and make some changes so that we can also not just have this as a dictionary, but export it as a CSV. So I changed product infos to a list, and then in the first row, actually, I just need to make this single row rather than the whole thing. So I made a first row of titles, and then I've made, after I extract all the information, I just make a new row which has each of them in line, and then appended that to the list. And then the last thing that I've done is use CSV, and you can just copy this out, but essentially just make a location for where I want to save the CSV file. I open that file, I create a write of the CSV file, and then I just write rows, one for each of the product infos. So if I run this again, it'll take again a second to run through everything, but afterwards we will have a CSV file which is ready to go with all of our information. And so here is the final rendered CSV file, which was automatically generated with that script, which you can see has the product code, name, price, and product URL for each of the products that we automatically scraped through there. Okay, so the last method that we need to go over is rendered browser emulation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through an example where you would discover that the other two methodologies can't work and why you would need to use rendered browser emulation, as well as then explain how to do it and what it does to get around the issues. So we're going to use, as an example for this, the same one that we used before, which is the automationdirect.com website, and we're going to want to extract out the information on each of these products. So similarly, we're going to go right click and inspect to check out the area, and then very similar to the last example, you can see that we have a bunch of divs with the class of table view row entry, which means that we can do something almost exactly the same as what we did before. So you can see what I did here is I copied out just this first section into a new file, and I've just changed the URL to the new URL of automationdirect.com. And then we're just going to go through, again, find all div, but we've changed the class to table view row entry instead of in the previous example, which was category product. Now, I just want to show this as an example here as well, as what we're going to have come out is, oops, sorry, wrong example. It's going to get a failed to get page 406, and I just wanted to use this to demonstrate that this was why I had this headers here before. This is a problem, honestly, I didn't understand at the start either. You just Google it, this comes up in one of the Stack Overflow responses. It just requires a certain type of header to prove that you're, essentially this is like the type of information that a browser would send up to say, hey, I'm a Macintosh computer running an Intel chip and I'm running Mozilla Firefox. So it's just kind of like spoofing what the browser would send up to make sure that this doesn't think that you're an automated script, because a lot of websites don't necessarily want you web scraping their websites because it costs them money to run servers, and so if you run this 100 times, that's a lot more than just a regular user would use. So if I add in that header, which I just pulled directly from some forum on the internet, and run it again, you can see that in this case I get a result of like an empty list. So why is that? Why does my same methodology not work in this case? So let's run and debug and stop it on this point so we can check out what else is inside soup. So if we go to the debug console and type in soup, which is that structured thing. So this is the entire HTML of the website that came down at the start. And I'm not going to take you through the whole thing, but if you do go through and check, especially if you can search inside here for table view row entry, and there is nothing in there. Now, why is that? The reason is that this website uses JavaScript to pull down that information after the fact. And we actually already knew that in this particular case because we saw the API that pulls down that information. Now, maybe that API is going to be like difficult to get and obfuscate or whatever. So for whatever reason, we can't get access to it through that method. We know that it pulls it down afterwards. So that means that the original HTML that you get in that first request, so this one here, does not contain the information that you want. So if you can't use the API and you can't directly look through the HTML, what do you do next? Well, the easy answer is that you do exactly what the browser does. So you actually just use an instance of Chrome to load it up, to run that JavaScript, pull down the information, render it into HTML, and then after it's done all that, you'll have a new version of the HTML that your browser has modified, which you can then go through and check in a very similar way that we did before. So, in order to do what I just described of rendering your own version of Chrome, pulling information directly from the browser that you've run, we're going to use a tool called Selenium. So Selenium is a tool that someone has developed which has various interfaces for different languages, so you don't necessarily have to use Python. A lot of people, for example, use Java or JavaScript to interact with it. And it does, like we were saying before, it opens a version of Chrome and then allows you to directly go through it. So I've just Googled there, Selenium getting started, and then I'm going to go down to write your first Selenium script. And this is just a really good explanation of how to get started and do the most basic things that you need to do with Selenium. So what you're going to do is you're going to open a driver, and what that's going to do is it's going to use Selenium to open a version of Chrome. And then very similar to just using the request before, we're just going to drive a .get, which is going to open that URL within Chrome. So I will just note that I'm setting up, my setup here is a little bit different because I'm running a dev container, so I'm running everything inside a Docker container. So you'll notice that when I open up my driver, I'm actually using a WebDriver remote, and I'm running it on like a local server that I'm doing. Don't worry about that too much, it's just a slightly different version because I'm doing something a little bit more fancy in my setup, but it's effectively exactly the same thing as running this here. So we could just replace this section here with webdriver.chrome, and it would operate exactly the same way. I just wanted to get that explanation out of the way, and at the end of this video I will actually explain how and why I made this setup and why it could be very useful to you as well. So one thing that I do also want to note is that learning how to use Selenium is a very useful skill in specifically for testing front-end web development. So you may have guessed that the main reason that Selenium exists is actually for people that are making their own websites. If you need to test the way that users interact with the website, doing that directly in code is very difficult for the same reason that it's difficult for us to extract the information out of this thing that's rendered by JavaScript. And so when we're doing tests, we want the test to be as close to the real world application as possible. So we want it to be able to open in Chrome, but you also maybe want to open it in Internet Explorer or Safari or whatever it is, and Selenium lets you do that as well. So I just wanted to point it out that this is a very useful skill for testing in front-end applications as well, and that's actually how I first learned how to use Selenium. But it can be used in web scraping purposes as well, which I'll go through now. So let's start to understand how I've written this little script here. So first I've just imported a bunch of things, nothing particularly complicated. The main important thing is that I was importing from Selenium the driver things to create this driver, which again is just exactly how they've done it inside this section here. So they've done webdriver.chrome, and I'm just using the .remote for my weirdly set up system. So the one thing that I am doing here, which is potentially going to be useful to you, is that I'm setting up the creation of my driver in a context manager. And essentially what that just means is it allows me to wrap these things in a try-catch statement. So what I do is I set up all the things for my driver, which is going to open Chrome. But then if anything goes wrong, the last thing that it does is it quits out of it. That's very important because if you don't have this running, if you don't have this set up to quit afterwards, what will happen is your Chrome will just like hang and stay there, and it won't close down the window that it opened. I find it very convenient, and also this is very necessary because I have this weird setup in Docker container. So again, I just want to explain, that's why I have this in the context manager, which just allows me to go with Chrome driver as driver, and whenever I do that, it will export driver as yielded from this output driver, which comes down here. All that to say, you could do exactly the same thing by, rather than having this here, you could just have driver equals web driver.chrome, and you don't need any of this with section. It's just something that I set up to have this catch ability to still close Chrome if an error gets encountered. Okay, so with all that complicated stuff out of the way, let's just run it and see how it looks. So in your case, if you just copy in the chrome.driver section down to the bottom here, it will just open Chrome on your host machine. In my case, because I'm running it in a Docker, I'm just using a VNC, which is kind of just like a remote desktop viewer to view inside the Docker, because I'm kind of running it in sort of like a virtual machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run my example again. I'm going to tab out to this, and you can see that it opens Chrome, it goes to that website, and it scrolls down to the section I'm looking at to make sure that it's in view, and it's now doing the section where it's extracting all of the data, which happens very similarly to the section that we had with basic web scraping, static web scraping. You'll notice that it only just finished, so it actually took quite a long time to run that, and that's because this method isn't just pulling text from an API, from like a web server, and then passing through that. It's actually opening Chrome to have all of that rendered in the same way that a user would interact with it. And obviously, a user interacting with it, it's going to have to like take all that HTML, display all the tables, it'll pull those other JavaScripts, requests that get made, change the data, update the UI and everything like that. And so I just note this to say that if you're doing something like, for example, in our previous example where we were going through each individual page and we were making a new request, that's fairly quick to do if you're just using like directly the HTML and you're pulling it from that. But if you do it with Selenium, then it will have to open Chrome and load that page for each of those new pages that you do. And so this can actually take a significant period of time. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, this may be a really big problem, or it might not be that big of an issue. Because if you're just going for like a single web scraping demo, you just want to get this off once, you're happy for it to run for 20 minutes or however long it may end up taking for a complicated thing, that's fine. If you are running a test for like verifying your own web design, like I was talking about before, that you can set up in like an automated pipeline, that might not be okay. And so there may be some conditions where you might think that using Selenium is not that great of an idea. So now I'll just quickly take you through what we're actually doing in this script to pull out that information. And again, it's very similar to what we were doing previously with beautiful soup on the static HTML example. But in this case, what we're using is something called XPath. But this import of by, which is something that you import directly from Selenium WebDriver common by, and again, this is just in all the examples, is something that you can use to determine what elements you're looking for from several different things. So we could do by XPath, but we could also do by CSS selector if you know anything about CSS, and you can do other things like there's a few other methodologies. But if you look up XPath, XPath is just kind of this definition which allows you to do to specify things in the same way that these beautiful soup calls were doing before. So here we defined find all for each div where the class was a category product. So very similar here, what we're doing is we're just defining that in this X path, which is just a kind of script, and we're saying we're looking for any, well in this case, let's say because it's easier, any button elements that has a class of CC, NB, OK, agree. So this definition is exactly the same way they were doing it as Beautiful Soup. It's just a different way to write it. And then here we're writing driver.findElements, which again, extremely similar to this soup.find. In this case we're doing find all, but you can do find, which just looks for a single element, because here we're also just looking for a single element. And then, yeah, once we get this button, this is actually so that we can remove the accept cookies banner. So what I'll do is I'll actually add a breakpoint here, and I'll run it again, and I'll show you why we need to do that, which is another example of why Selenium is sometimes bothersome. So to demo what we're doing here, what I've just done is I've added in a breakpoint, and I'm just going to run and debug. It's going to pop that up. In your case, it's just going to open Chrome. In my case, it's opening it inside this VNC section. Then you'll see that down here at the bottom, there is actually a banner that has, we're tracking your cookies. We need you to select if you want to allow us to do that or not. Now, the problem is that because Selenium is actually making clicks on individual interactions in the website, it's not just pulling data, it's interacting with it as if it were a user. If you don't remove this, then the next step where you look for a particular method of just like opening this table view here, so if we want to open like this, it will actually be hidden behind this banner, and when it attempts to make that click, it won't be able to make that click. You can see down here the buttons behind the banner, and it will just error out. And so that's one of the sort of like complexities that you're going to have to deal with if you're using Selenium. So if I keep stepping through here, so I'm going to step over. So we're going to click that button, and now if we go back, you'll see that the banner's gone, because it's literally gone through and clicked that OK button. So then just the last step, so I'm not going to spoon feed this last bit to you, but we're just looking for this method of activating the table. So if I go back and I change it back to like the list, and then I run this section, which looks for that button and then clicks it, I'm going to step over, and you can see that it's taken us back to table view. And then similarly to what we did back in Beautiful Soup, we just looked for all of the elements that have this ID, which is the product list table, the single one. And then inside that, we look for the row elements, which again, we're using this XPath thing where we look for divs that contain table row entry, which is how we are doing it with Beautiful Soup before as well. So again, we go through, we extract all the data, and then just like we did before as well, we're going to save it as a CSV file. And so the final output that we have is this CSV file containing the product name, the price, and in this case I haven't actually extracted the horsepower, but that's something you can do. And there you go. That is the other way of extracting out this information using Selenium, which is a rendered method of web scraping. That's pretty much it, guys. That covers the 3 different options. So again, if you're trying to web scrape off, so if you have some example like this automation direct website where you're trying to automatically extract information, first thing that you're always going to want to do is inspect, because then that can also let you get into the network console. And if you're lucky, your data is going to be straight there. You just want to filter by XHR, and then you clear it from here. You run the section that you want to do. So I'm going to go to this list. You look through the responses that they give by just clicking on it and going to response. Maybe you get lucky. If you can't find the response immediately, you may still be able to find an API that they have that's open, which you can use something like Python to make requests from. If you can't use either of those methods, that's when you resort to using something like Beautiful Soup to see if you can directly pull it out from the HTML, because that's a little bit simpler than just running Selenium. It's also quicker. And then finally, if you discover that it's actually a rendered page and it's impossible to get things out from Beautiful Soup directly, you then would finally go to Selenium and write a small script like this. And those are the methodologies that I would recommend for web scraping data off of a website like this. If you have any other sort of specific examples you need help with, or if you have any other questions, feel free to message me on Slack if you're with the Gear Center, or just drop a comment on YouTube if you are not.